So today for workshop 9, our agenda, we're going to be looking at the first, the intercultural learning activity first. That is the case study with Sven and G from China and Sweden. We'll have a breakout session for that so you all can discuss the case study. And then we'll start talking about different types of activities, the elements that go into those activities. We'll look at the Hubicle as a resource for our intercultural activities, and with that we'll review some things within the hub and then start talking about how we can revise existing tools, but also, based on the things we're going to talk about today, potentially also creating our own tools and how we go about adding those to the hub, since that is one of the requirements for IPG, is either creating or revising an existing tool and putting that in the hub, in the digital toolbox that we have there. And then we'll, of course, have a Q&A wrap up at the end. So for intercultural activity 9, as I mentioned, this is the case study. And what we're focusing on, the competence for this particular activity, is cultural worldview frameworks. And we've had one of these before. If any of you were, I believe it was workshop 2, if any of you were in that, we did a worldview frameworks activity, but I wanted to make sure you all weren't able to, or were not involved in that workshop, that you would get some here in this one. So this activity is looking at different elements of how we create and understand our worldview. So if you look at the capstone level, someone at this proficiency level is able to demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of the complexity of elements important to members of another culture in relation to these elements of worldview, which are history, values, politics, communication styles, economy, beliefs, and practices. So each of these things are elements that go into constructing a worldview. Of course, we have these within our own worldview, how we perceive the world and understand it, and people from other cultures have their own information in regard to each of these elements, and that makes up how they view the world.
Dan, can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
What is the meaning of the or?
So complexity of elements important to members of another in relation to its history, values, politics, communication. Okay, so the idea here is it can be all of these, or it can be one or another, or in particular. So the idea is that not each one of these elements doesn't always come into play depending on the context that we're talking about, what topic is being looked at. So, if it is primarily a question of religion, politics may not come, it may not come into that particular conversation. So that's where the or, it could be this or it could be that, is playing a role. And how deeply do we understand that, not from our own worldview, but from their worldview? Does that explain it a little bit? Hopefully addresses your question. I think it's, for me, it's an and or. Rather than just,
I would get an and, but the or is like, it's all these things, or we're just going to rely on beliefs and practices.
Right. As with most things, when we're talking about culture, it's context specific.
Yes,
so
yes. Okay.
I prefer the and or than just or.
Okay. But it's common through all of the descriptions in there, or beliefs and practices. So it's
right.
Okay,
right.
I better understand what the or is really about.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. And of course, the other thing we can notice from each level is this kind of increasing intensity or complexity, going from surface understanding, partial understanding, adequate understanding, to sophisticated understanding. And then it's, it still has the complexity of elements in there, because that's what we want them to understand. It's not just enough to know, oh yes, they have history and I understand a little bit of that history, but they need to as they become more sophisticated in this, understanding deeper and more deeply the complexity of that history, complexity of the politics and so on.
So to use a recent example, I just heard, what day was it? Yesterday or the day before, about 330,000 young, mostly men, have been, I'm not sure how that number came about, but it has to do with the French Catholic Church and sexual abuse. And I'm like, how could a 330,000? I mean, that's like, I can't even imagine that many.
Yeah.
But it has to be a cultural dynamic going on there for 330,000
Yeah.
to have experienced that, is my guess, but I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's what I was just sort of putting that news story into this context and trying to figure out how do I make sense of that.
Yeah, it's quite possible that it may be a question of, we're going to talk about Hofstede's diversity dimensions. It could be a question of power distance and hierarchy that in general, French culture may have a different relationship to hierarchy than the US culture. That may play into it. I can only speculate and make guesses at this point, but I'm willing to guess. But it may be other factors of maybe there just happen to be kind of a perfect storm of predators in that particular country. I don't know, but something like that, certainly, I think it's worth examining. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up, Anita.
Well, and again, as we talk about different culture, it may not necessarily be the culture of France. It may be the culture of the Catholic Church in France.
Absolutely. Yeah. Specifically,
because
that particular group within France.
Under that bishop, I mean, I'm not Catholic. I don't understand the whole Catholic hierarchy, but I know there's levels between priests and the Pope.
Yeah. 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 I would definitely, that would be part of it. I would assume that to be part of it. Yeah. You guys are already demonstrating levels of sophisticated understanding of cultural worldview frameworks just in this conversation. So this is nice. Not that the topic is all, but anyway. We are going to go into some breakout rooms here in just a second. And these questions also, again, I think I've brought this up before. At one point, I had the ability to share my screen to all of the breakout rooms so you can see them. I don't have that ability. It's disappeared on me. I've been looking for it. So if you want to take a screen grab or whip out your phone and take a snapshot of the screen, or if you do have the Brightspace module 9 up, these questions are also in the Meet section. They're posted there. So when you go into breakout rooms and you want to have those questions handy to make sure you're able to talk about each one of those. We're going to go into our breakout rooms for about 15 minutes to discuss these questions. And since there are only about 9 of you, I think we'll do groups of 3. I think that will work pretty well. And then I'll give you a warning a few minutes out, and then you'll get the 1-minute countdown towards the end. Okay, I'll see you guys in a little bit. Welcome back.
It's so weird when we just completely are in mid-sentence and we just get sucked right out.
It's
a little
Sorry.
whiplash.
It feels like a Star Trek, like we're being
Doesn't it?
transported to the next realm.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm glad you all are having great conversations, though. That's my assumption there. That the ongoing talking is because we don't want to stop. I sent in a message. Hopefully, you all got a chance to designate. I'd like to have 3 people join me in the fishbowl. Kind of one representative from each group to discuss these questions briefly. And again, if it's been a while since you've done the fishbowl, turning off your camera, and then you can click that setting to hide non-video participants, and then you should only see Denise and Joe and Jorge and I in the fishbowl. So why don't we start with the first? Does anyone want to go first, and we can tackle one question at a time, or maybe just we'll tackle all three at the same time? I think we can do that.
I'll go with the first one. I think we were looking at differences in gender, differences in thinking on how hierarchies in the company work, even in communication, on direct communication and more passive communication. The aspect of making decisions in the individualistic culture versus more group culture, all those aspects were in play, I think, in the conflict.
Denise or Joe, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, our group also discussed how so much of this also comes down to communication differences, and that can really snowball and make things worse. There are other underlying factors like the hierarchies that each of them are used to, but when you have bad communication, it just kind of makes everything more difficult. And so I guess then transitioning to, the second question, one thing that we discussed, I don't know if this exists in this company, but if there happened to be a Swede who'd, been in China for a while, maybe it's become more accustomed over the years to living there and its culture, you could, somehow arrange a meeting, for him to kind of share some of the things he's learned about the local culture and how that was different but complementary to his home culture. And if that employee didn't exist, likely there could be a consultant you could find who could play that kind of role to bridge the two in a very constructive way. There are other solutions as well, but that was one.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about what's top of mind for people that, in some countries you have more uncertainty avoidance because there's a higher penalty for failure. And for example, in China, that, if in Sweden, you might be thinking of any consequences for your promotion, your advancement, but there they'd be thinking of family and what it would do to their family if they fail, the shame, what might happen in terms of their connections to the Communist Party, politics. It's, it's even in universities. And so we just brought up, what's at stake and what are they thinking of? And I thought another person in the group brought up something interesting as well, that, capitalism creates, you're thinking of different things and profit loss versus, that might not be as top of a mind, but making sure you go through the ranks and get signatures, first and do the proper thing in the proper way in the proper time versus that stress of, losing money each day or something. So it's understanding the full picture.
Yes, absolutely.
I think jumping onto the second one, like Joe did, we saw mediation as a kind of a short-term way to resolve the conflict, but in a long term, we saw that the need for the corporation to define a kind of a policy in terms of how to collaborate between the two sites or the two countries, and in some way communicate that information to the employees so they will understand expectations and how to behave in those collaborations. But I think that it was interesting seeing that although the relationship between the two companies has been long enough, 12 years, but at least the one from China has been existing for 70. So there might be a lot more weight into the way that it was done things before than the way that is expected to be done now. So those changes in culture don't happen overnight, and there need to be some kind of a involvement. Again, not only mediation, but involvement from maybe the hierarchy above them to kind of establish what is the models of operandi at the corporate level.
Yes, those are really good points. In fact, some of this touches on, we just held the teamwork workshop on Tuesday, and part of that discussion is what contributes to the conflicts that arise when teams are working together with diverse team members. And you've touched on a couple of those issues and also the way that they need to be addressed. So one of those issues is, a history of positive interaction. So, having repeated interactions that have gone well is important to avoid conflict. But also, you mentioned the company needs to have a policy. So that would be institutional support. Is there institutional support for this team, both in providing them with a mediator is one way to support them. That's, as you mentioned, a short-term fix for this specific problem that they're having. But long-term is their institutional support of providing policies to very clearly define the ways teams should be working together. So if there are questions of hierarchy and do we need a signature, do we need approval? And of course, reading through Sven's side of the story, he's suggesting that no, this person should be able to work independently and take care of and be responsible for things on their own side without having to ask for permission. So these are things that would be very helpful for both sides to have the institution, the company, spell out, this is how we want you to work together. If you weren't a part of that workshop and you're interested in those dynamics of what can potentially cause conflict and some approaches to solving them, I encourage you to check out Module 8 and also the workshop recording as well. So some of the things that are also being touched upon in this conversation, I think are very important is, if you have someone who's from Sweden, who's been living in China, has that experience, but also providing Sven and G themselves, the employees, with information, knowledge about the other culture. That's very important. This is related to the problem we've been seeing in student exchange and study abroad and all of this. The old approach to intercultural development was exposure. We'll just put these people together and they'll figure it out, right? And that's kind of what they've done in this company. We'll put Sven and G in a team and they'll work it out. Maybe they will, but probably they won't. There's going to be conflict. But if you support them and give them information about each other's culture and help them negotiate an understanding about how they're going to work together based on that information, you're going to have far less conflict. It's the same thing with sending our students abroad in exchanges or taking them abroad. It's not just enough to expose them to the other culture. We have to facilitate what that exposure means. We have to help them process their experiences, and give them the tools to do that as well. So the third question, how might you use an activity like this with your students?
I think it's useful to teach how easily we make the wrong explanation for behavior, that whole thing about misattribution. If you teach people how they're likely to make errors in certain situations and either blame it on culture or ignore culture, and it's usually a mess of somewhere in between, as my group was discussing. It's really hard because it's all tangled up in your personality and it's all together. But I think it works if you just wake people up to misattributions and how they can go down the wrong path. And if they just figure out why somebody did something, they might have more harmony.
In our group, we didn't kind of go too far into how we might use it, but because there was a discussion, for example, about in which subjects something like this may fit. But one of the ideas was to adapt it and maybe make it something like more between Sweden and China, maybe more about north and south, or west or east, and within the country, for example, or even between genders and things like that. So modifying the scenario to other possible conflicts was an idea. But I think at the end of the day, we were looking into, it depends on the context will depend into what kind of subject is being included into.
Yes, and that's a really good point. There are whole books out there with intercultural case studies like this that you can, we have it listed in the digital toolbox. So yeah, bringing up different types of case studies where the differences aren't just national, they could be, within a single national culture, regional differences, absolutely. And of course, all the diversity dimensions, gender and various identities. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a very good point. Customizing it to your needs for your class.
So
Okay, sorry. Go
I
ahead,
was
John.
just going to explain that, you'd already touched on kind of what the activities and how we would use them, just making sure that all the parties had the knowledge necessary to be able to set communication guidelines that were most effective. And so we've really circled back to that as the outcome and how we would make it happen. I am, though, just through this conversation, this wasn't in our group, thinking about how, either of these two parties, like the Swedish or the Chinese employees and their companies, for them to most quickly understand some aspects of the other's culture, and any materials they're provided to understand it, they may understand some aspects quicker if, the briefing materials came from someone within their own nation, from their perspective. But on paper, while some things are objectively, make sense, some of these training materials could be seen as offensive to the other party, especially if they don't immediately identify, their culture and way of working as being influenced by, the political party or the, hundreds or thousands of years of imperial dynasties and the state structure and things like that. So, what are some thoughts about how to not offend while effectively, providing the most effective training in that regard?
That's a really great question. I want to open that up to the entire group. I'd love to hear your all's thoughts.
What about using movies? From, because that's a contemporary cultural activity, right? I mean, it's not your movie, it's a movie, but in the same genre, just to, and do some analysis. How is, the lead communicating with somebody else in the film, as ways of helping to identify, this is how we communicate in China or in Sweden.
I like the idea of the movie because at the end of the day, if you have in the group people that are from that region or nationality or that group, you can kind of pose the question about, is this represented accurately, or what's your opinion about the way that this person is behaving? Would you behave in the same way? That kind of dynamic might actually would be better to understand the context from those that are viewing. I mean, it happens a lot of times that if you basically judge United States based on the movies, that it will probably be a lot different on what you see in Hollywood from what you see in Central Indiana. But allowing that opportunity, that conversation to happen, would be great.
I kind of feel like I should just leave the meeting at this point. You guys got this covered. Jorge, that was a great response. I was just going to say, providing the space to pose a hypothesis. This is what I think is happening. Am I understanding this correctly? And I really appreciate that example of, we've just seen this scene from a movie or whatever. Do you relate to that? Is that something that you feel represents you, or do you differ from that? That's a great approach because it accomplishes a lot of different things at the same time. You've got a generalization being compared against a specific person, and you can have that juxtaposition and recognize that there's intracultural variance and diversity, that they're not monolithic. No group is monolithic. And also having that exchange, that cultural dialogue, sharing of information at a personal level is far more meaningful than here's an information sheet, read this and you'll know everything you need to know. So that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing those ideas.
I almost think underlying any approach, like whether you do a movie or whether you just ask directly or something, is being open and posing it as, hey, it's good if you disagree and talk more, like just that openness, because at least, I was teaching intercultural communication with MBAs, and, we would post something and then they would discuss, oh, that's only true for this group or this region, and even then they're still, of course, generalizing. And so it's always wrapping it up at the end going, and we all know a lot of other things drives behavior, and we've kind of reiterated a lot, but yeah, just being open that I'm not telling you, I'm asking, hey, what do you think of this? Really frees it up. And I don't know, I always expect more resistance than I've gotten, in a way, when I present cultural differences across different nationalities. It's like they understand, but then they want to qualify, and that's okay, that's learning. Yeah.
And one thing I did want to address specifically to Joe's question about offending that other cultural group, most often those offense is taken from application of stereotypes. Any description that is limiting is where we're going to see offense. If we can get past that to generalizations, that many people who are a member of this culture may exhibit this kind of a behavior, possibly, and even, again, getting to this hypothesis, I think my understanding is that maybe they behave this way because of, and this is kind of what we did, thinking about what are the diversity dimensions that come into play, the values and behaviors behind SPIN and G. We're forming these hypotheses about what we think is motivating these behaviors and the conflict. That's a useful process, and we want our students to do that too, to test out and theorize why they think things are happening the way they are. But then, as Jorge pointed out, that next step of asking those questions and finding out, comparing it to the real world and seeing what the answers are. So this is really great. I want us all to put on our pedagogical hats a little bit more firmly now. We're going to move on to the debriefing of this. During your breakout session, having this discussion about SPIN and G, how did that feel? What happened and how did that feel, having that conversation?
I guess because neither were Americans, that to me, it felt like, okay, this is outside, not inside.
Yep.
Yeah, and I immediately felt the lack of knowledge of one culture versus another. So then I wondered how insightful I could really be.
Yeah,
For me,
I would.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
So my program is actually going to be largely in Sweden. So it made me, think about, these things, and as well as, how I'm also going to find differences between, nearby countries from Sweden, and just want to go read more to see if beforehand I can get some context on that.
Personally, I would like to echo what Denise said, in the sense that even when the case study present some background in terms of management style, communication, and things like that, I felt bad about trying to generalize things, because it's kind of like, even still talking about people that you don't necessarily know, and it's kind of I think I still feel uneasy about blaming it on the culture, rather than trying to look into what is happening specifically with the event or the conflict. So going from the generalization to, well, maybe this is just an outlier, but let's kind of see what a little bit more what's going on in this particular situation, or is this really a generalization? And I guess the feeling, I guess from from emotional perspective, was kind of feeling that uneasiness of trying to make a case for the circumstance versus just general culture.
Trying to unmute myself and I clicked on the wrong thing here. That's a really good point. You know, we can look at those generalizations about the two cultural groups, China and Sweden. But at the end of the day, if we're really applying this to the real world, Sven and G are two individual people. What is their personal relationship to one another in this context? As far as what is their history? Has this been an ongoing conflict? And there's been multiple instances, and we get a little of that in the case study. But, you know, one of the questions is, if you were their manager, how would you help them? I would want to have deeper conversations with each one. What has been your experiences? Try to get as much information as possible, because certainly those cultural norms do come into play. They're unavoidable, but how are these two individually intersecting with their own culture in regard to this specific instance? So I think that's worth exploring as well. So, you know, I think the question I wanted to focus on with this debrief, I think we've talked about already, that kind of what next. If you were to use this, what would you, what, if anything, would you follow it with? So we've kind of looked at how you might use this with your students. But let's say you've used something like a case study, not necessarily this one, with your students to have them explore these ideas. What might you want to follow up on that with? How would you want that? What would you want them to take away from looking at a case study like this?
Somebody mentioned the role of learning to generalize, so they're not left with just the one instance, but they get the underlying concepts. And so having them think through their interactions across different cultures and different groups is probably what I would try and do next, so that they weren't left with a single instance. So practicing, that's important, and also generalizing.
Yeah, that's really a great idea.
One thing that I thought of, I taught a seminar class on leadership, and I had them to look at leadership in different regions and how that may relate. And so I looked at it from a global melting pot situation. Even though, let's just say you're at a company here in America, that students or your coworkers may have the, how can I say it, the history or the learning or the experience from another culture. And so it may influence of how they interact. So how can you transfer some of the skills that you have learned from this with two people from different countries and apply it here? Because the thing about it is, let's just say you have a firstborn American who Asian descent. That doesn't mean that their parents are not going to teach them the history of Asia and how they think business should run. And so when you're having those conflicts, and even though that's an Asian American and you are, say, African American, doesn't mean that you'll have an American global perspective. You have to look at what you're learning. So I will look at the transferable skills and how to apply it in different situations with people who may have backgrounds, and understand what a background is, and not just I identify as this, but.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. Thank you, Natasha. Anyone else? Okay, to go along with this, just a little bit more information. You know, the handout with Sven and G, that case study, did provide some information from the Hofstede country comparison tool. And here's a breakdown of the 6 cultural dimensions that the Hofstede system kind of looks at. We have low and high power distance, collectivistic versus individualistic. feminine versus masculine, low uncertainty avoidance versus high uncertainty avoidance, short-term orientation, long-term orientation, and then restraint versus indulgence. It's important to recognize that this is a spectrum or a scale from 0 to 100. And again, anytime we use a tool like this, it's important that not only do we understand this, but if we're going to be using it with our students, that they recognize that these are generalizations. That's kind of a trend or tendency within a particular national culture may look like this, but within that national culture, there are always individuals who differ and can differ to varying degrees along this spectrum. So it's a starting point. It's not meant to be applied universally to every individual or member from that culture. So it's very important that any use of a tool like that is thoroughly discussed so that it's not misapplied, because we don't want to get into the realm of stereotyping people. And again, the idea that cultural groups are not monolithic. It's meant just to start the conversation, to have a starting point to delve into more deeply. So I do want to share that. I'm going to get off of here real quick and bring up the country comparison tool. If I can do that. It is here. So this is the Hofstede website, Hofstede Insights, where you can go in and, oops, trying to get to the screen here where I can move stuff around, where you can enter in different, I'm not sure why I'm having issues with, let's see if I can resize this and that'll allow me to,
Is
It's
this
not letting
in the
me-
hub?
No, this is a separate website. This is hofstedeinsights.com. I'm not sure why it's not letting, let me try to refresh. It's not giving me the scroll bar because there's info. Here we go. That was strange. I don't know why it was doing that, but, and of course now it's doing it again. So I have to keep it at this size, I think. You can enter in
So
different
my screen hasn't
countries.
changed.
You
My
have to
screen
reshare
has-
your window, Dan.
I have to reshare. it.
Yeah, my
Okay,
screen
sorry.
hasn't changed. Yeah.
Okay, let me see if, let me do it this way. Okay, are you seeing this now where I can scroll?
We
You're
are
seeing the
now.
Hofstede? You're not
Yes,
seeing
sir.
the Hofstede?
Yeah,
Yes,
we are now.
Yes.
Might have been delayed for a second. So you can enter in different countries and then they will appear down here. I'll take the United States out real quick so you can see how it adjusts it kind of automatically. And it provides you with a score for each one of these dimensions. And of course, you can go down and look at one country at a time. So these are tabs, so they're divided into tabs. And I can look at each diversity dimension for each country, and it will give me an explanation of that country's score and what that kind of means for the way they behave in regard to that particular diversity dimension. And I can do that for each one of these. And of course, you know, if I'm using this with my students, I may just want to focus on one of these, like individualism versus collectivism. I can hone in on this and just focus on that with my students. But quite frequently, and worth discussing with students, is how these interact with one another. So the fact that the United States is very high individualism and kind of below lower power distance, that has a big impact on how we, you know, have this autonomy, the sense of the ability to work independently. Those two, there's an interplay there. So that's, I think, you know, can be discussed as well, combining diversity dimensions. So I just wanted to briefly share this tool. It's hofstede-insights.com. But you can just Google Hofstede. It'll be one of the top results, and that'll get you there really quickly. But again, that would be something that would need to be kind of prefaced with your students. You want them to know that, you know, we don't want to get into stereotyping. So bear with me as I move some things around here. We're going to move ahead. Make some adjustments. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about activities. We just did this case study. That's one particular type of activity. But before we get to creating our own activities, we need to understand them within the context of a particular framework. I started with the AAC&U rubric, intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric. That's this one, and focusing in on worldview frameworks. That was the context for that particular activity with the Sven and G case study there. So anytime we're going to design an activity, we need to have a particular framework that we're working in that underpins, what is the purpose of this activity and what are we wanting our students to learn out of it. So one theoretical model that, I think we touched on a little bit, but this was created by Michael Vandenberg or Mick Vandenberg. If some of you may have actually had the opportunity to meet Mick. He's been on our campus a few times doing IDI training. He came up with his own theory of a 4-phase developmental framework. This is awareness of self, awareness of others, developing emotional resilience, and then the capacity to bridge cultural difference, so bridging. So, and then this cycles back through. I think the kind of novel approach to this that's really important is this idea of emotional resilience. And if we compare this to other frameworks like the AAC&U's intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric, what comes to mind for me in regard to emotional resilience is openness and empathy. Specifically in if I'm feeling overwhelmed by my experience with with that other culture is, if I'm overwhelmed, I'm not in a place of learning. I can't move, I can't interact. I'm going to retreat and go back in my shell. So if we want our students to kind of stay in that Vygotsky zone of learning, we need them to have emotional resilience. We need them to remain open to experiencing things objectively so they don't get stressed out or overwhelmed. So that's one of the things that Mick Vandenberg's model tries to address, is that while we're developing our awareness of ourselves and culturally and awareness of other cultures, we also need to be developing emotional resilience to engaging with cultural difference. So that's something that this model looks at. And it might be worthwhile thinking about activities that help students develop their emotional resilience as part of their intercultural development. And then bridging is that next step of, yes, I can be aware of my own culture and be aware of that other culture, and I can bridge and kind of do that code switching between my cultural worldview perspective and theirs and adapt appropriately. But can I do that for others? Can I serve as a bridge for other people who maybe don't have that capacity? So that's another kind of perspective there. And bridging involves a lot of different things. If we look at this explanation here, it's reframing our experiences, shifting our perspective, attuning our emotions, and adapting our behavior in effective and appropriate ways, which sounds a lot like this model of intercultural development, the continuum here with adaptation. So bridging and adaptation align quite closely. If you've done the IDI before, you're probably very familiar with the orientations there, but if you've not taken the IDI, and again, if you're new to intercultural competence, if you've not used an assessment tool before, specifically if you've not done the IDI, I do want to encourage you to do that. We will foot the bill. Somar is going to foot the bill for that. There's I think for professionals, the price is $18. And I think for students, it's $12 for a student IDI. So that's something to keep in mind. And the descriptions here describe a person's mindset in regard to their relationship to difference, how they engage with difference, how they understand difference, what their relationship is to difference. So denial tends to miss difference. Polarization is judging difference as one is better or worse. Minimization is de-emphasizing difference for the purpose of focusing on commonality, similarity. Acceptance is a deep comprehension of that difference that requires specific factual knowledge. And again, this ties into worldview frameworks, knowing all the politics and economy and history and values and belief systems, and really having a deep understanding of that is how someone gets to acceptance. Because one thing I always tell people is the specific use of acceptance within this model isn't like our general everyday use of acceptance. This is accepting difference on its terms, not on my terms, not according to my worldview, but according to their worldview. And then adaptation is that next step of making informed decisions about how I'm going to behave to act appropriately or meet their expectations for behavior, what they would expect a member of their culture to do and how to act. So again, you can use a framework like this to begin to frame activities of, if the majority of my students, if I use the IDI, for example, and the majority of my students are in polarization and minimization, what activities do I want to give them to help them begin to move forward on this continuum? So if they're polarizing difference, I want to help them start to look at difference objectively. Try not to be so judgmental. Instead of comparing better or worse, I want them to begin to see it as apples and oranges. So I want to design my activities to help them work on that. So that may be helping them practice objectivity. So there's a great activity called DIE, Describe, Interpret, Evaluate, which is really about helping them realizing that we have a natural tendency to evaluate circumstances and contexts and skipping over the description part. And when you're engaging with cultural difference, that's a key step. What exactly am I looking at here versus what do I think is happening? Because the gap between the two is quite big, and we may be making some leaps in logic there that we need to examine. But likewise, if my students are mostly in minimization and I want to help them get to acceptance, it may just be a matter of saying, look, we can't ignore that difference. We can't just focus on what we have in common. We have to learn about that difference. We have to gain information. So my activities may want to target that. So this is another way we can use framework, a theoretical model, to decide how we're going to structure our activities. And then finally, the rubric, which we've already been looking at throughout this series, different activities that are targeting a specific competence and a specific competency level, depending on if they're at benchmark or milestones 2 or 3 or the capstone, moving them towards capstone. What does that involve with, in worldview frameworks, getting them from demonstrating a partial understanding to having them demonstrate adequate understanding? Of course, we'll need to define for our group what that means in relationship to history and or values and or politics and so on. Hope you appreciate me bringing in and or, but we'll need to define that and help our students move toward that. And our activities should be, helping them make those steps. So there are different types of activities.
Dan?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, please.
Before we go on, I'm going to lower my hand. With the rubric that you just mentioned, I remember in one of the activities before when you were showing us how to customize a rubric. If we customize a rubric for like the intercultural activities, do we have to keep adjusting for every intercultural activity that we're trying to do? Or can we use kind of like a broad one that will fit with some of these different things that we are using? Does that make
Yes.
sense?
So the nice thing about this is these are infinitely customizable. So if you're going to customize your rubric, you can also customize so you might find an activity that is focusing on, that was designed based on the AAC&E rubric and may only focus on that particular definition of worldview frameworks. But if you've taken that rubric and kind of customized it with additional information, you can still use that original activity that's based on the original rubric, but you can add to that activity that focus of, I want to add in this additional information. I want them to also have that as part of the discussion in this particular activity. So yes, you do want to kind of customize your activity to match the rubric, because ultimately when you're using a rubric that way and you're customizing a rubric, is you are changing the focus of what it is I want my students to learn. You're changing the learning outcome for them and saying, I want them to learn this additional component or this change in that rubric. And then we should carry that through with how we're assessing them and how we're providing intervention.
Okay, I'll follow up. And I hope this is going to be really quick because I know you're on a time limit. So with the first intercultural session that we had, when it was talking about look at the objectives, like what you want to accomplish, and kind of work backwards from that. So should we hold off on customizing or doing the rubric until we know what it is that we're looking at for our program? If we want to do openness, worldview, or something, and then look at activities and then kind of formulate all of that and then do the rubric, or should it go the other way?
Yeah, I know. I think you're onto something there. I think you start with the simplest version of that and work through it. And then it's a cycle and it's iterative. So you come back around and then let's re-examine the learning outcomes. Do I want to make some changes and customize this a little bit more? And then I'll go back and add that to each step along the way. And it's this iterative, cyclical process where you're refining. But yeah, I think you should start with the simplest form and then increase the complexity as you go.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, these are great questions. So again, what I have here is on the left, we have different types. So you have experiential activities, and they may be collaborative, where you want the groups to work together to accomplish whatever that experiential task is. We have different media resources that you might want to employ to have them examine and look at. There's also reflection activities that may be a follow-up to an experiential activity, or it may just be a general think back to your past experiences and let's reflect on them in a specific way. And then of course, assessments can themselves be a type of activity. And the idea, I think, is a really great example of that. The students might take the assessment, but when they get their results, or even if they have a group debrief, that conversation itself is a type of activity of having them think through where they are on this intercultural development continuum and what that means and what the different behaviors are and how we can frame and understand intercultural development according to that model. That in and of itself is a learning experience. Different elements that need to be considered when we're creating activities. What is the size of our group? Do I want it to be an activity that the whole class is working on simultaneously? Do I want them to get into small groups, or do I want to divide the class in half and then bring them back? So those are things to consider. How long of an activity do you want to have? I want to have an icebreaker and then maybe a 15-minute activity and then another 15-minute activity. Or do I want to have an activity that will have a little bit of time at the beginning, but then we'll spend the rest of the class time working on this one thing? Or maybe it spans multiple days. Cost. Do you have, for your course or your project, do you have some funds at your disposal to buy materials and or a particular set of tools that you need in order to carry out an activity? Whether or not the activity is kinesthetic. If you want something that makes your kids get up and move, that's something to consider, versus maybe if you're leading a study abroad and you're trapped on the bus and movement is not really an option, we need an activity that eliminates moving around and they can do from their seats. And then again, what is the theoretical framework you're working at? This is my personal formula. This is my theory. I haven't published it by any means. This is just from years of experience of doing this. The way I understand intercultural growth and development is based on a series of things that happen that allow us to grow. And the first step there is experience. So the first variable is, what is the experience that we're having? And what is our immediate reaction to that experience? And that can be just like we did. We did an activity with some questions, and then we debriefed it right after with the case study that we did. Then there needs to be some time, and that the length of that time can vary. It can be within one class session. You do an activity at the beginning, and then you talk about it at the last 5 minutes of class, or the last 10 minutes of class. Or it can be more long-term, and I really think the longer the better, but you don't want to get too far removed that you forget details. But that time allows your subconscious to process what happened in that experience, what was I experiencing? And then coming back to deeper reflection, intentional reflection. And that's where your theoretical model comes into play as well. I think about the IDI, I ask students when they have their developmental orientation, they know they're, for example, at minimization, I will ask them, when you reflect on how were you minimizing in that experience? How were you focusing on how we're all human and we're all the same and we have something in common, and ignoring the part that is different? And for your development, you want to get closer to acceptance. So how do you focus on that difference? How do you ask questions about it and learn about it? So that becomes part of that reflection, intentional reflection as well. If you do these things, you're going to grow interculturally, even if you don't want to. It's going to happen. That's my personal take on this. So I wanted to share that. So in regard to that, I also have that worksheet that I provided that goes into activity design, touches on each of these things. So there is this idea of you have an experience, there's some debriefing that takes place, and I've included this Kolb's experiential learning cycle: concrete experience, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, kind of that what's next, and active experimentation, getting our students to test out theories and hypotheses, and then in concrete experiences or for concrete experiences, and then beginning that cycle all over again. Again, time and reflection. So with the experience, you have the objective in mind, you're preparing them, giving them some additional information, and then giving them the experience. Here's the thing I want you to do. Built into that, you need to understand this Sanford's balance of challenge and support. You're giving them an activity that's going to challenge them. How challenging is that for them? You need to figure that out, and that will determine how much support you need to give them. And that can be in the form of that preparation information, or it can be as they're working through it, you're there to answer questions or even ask them questions to move them along, providing them support. In debriefing, again, this is their immediate reaction, helping them make connections. What is the relevance of this experience I just had? And you can use different approaches to debriefing. There's the Tyagi method. There's even the more simplified version, the what, so what, now what, to just getting them kind of stepping through each of those phases as they reflect on that experience. And then giving them that time to process the experience subconsciously, internalizing what happened, integrating it into how they understand whatever that was that they experienced. And then finally, that deeper reflection. And deeper reflection can take a lot of different forms. Having them journal or write an essay, answering an essay prompt, or having another group discussion. So there's a lot of different ways they can do that. So I'm trying to be aware of the clock. I know we have about 15 minutes left, so I want to get through some information that's really important, and that is with the Intercultural Learning Hub, because you're all going to need to engage with this for that particular requirement for IPG, which is contributing to the digital toolbox. So I mentioned there are different types of tools, different types of activities. The ones we're mainly going to be focusing on will be experiential learning activities and or reflections and assessments. Those are the kind of the easy things that we can kind of take a look at, and if you want to do a revision, for example. All of these things are compiled in our digital toolbox. We curate them. So it's kind of like a library of different assessments, different activity tools. You can look them up, they're searchable. So here's a glimpse of what that looks like, what the digital toolbox looks like. You can select group size, cost, how long it is, what type of a tool is it, an activity or an assessment, whether or not it's kinesthetic. We primarily organize these according to the AAC&U rubric, the competencies, but there's also an advanced search. You can look. We also categorize them according to the intercultural development continuum. Is this good for people in polarization or minimization? So there's different ways you can look up for this. But when you're contributing, if you're creating a brand new tool, you've got an activity that you use with your students already, you're ready to go to the create a tool and you can start entering that information in there. If you're revising a tool, you'll have to kind of draft that separately, like in Microsoft Word or whatever, and then you and I will kind of collaborate on getting that into your version, into the existing tool that's already there.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah.
So I'm out here in the Hubicle,
Mhm.
and I'm at the beginning dashboard. Where do I start?
If you go up to the top there where it says Discover Community About
Yes.
Support,
Yes.
hover over Discover, and
Okay.
then the second
Oh, I
option there
see.
will
I
be
see.
Digital
Yep.
Toolbox.
Okay. Got it. Okay. Okay.
Yep. And if you're wanting to create your tool, you have that create a tool, and this is the type of information you'll need to put in there. You'll need to give your tool a nice pithy name, something that maybe is easy to remember, fairly short. don't worry about being overly detailed in your title. This is not a conference presentation. And then select what kind of tool type it is, whether or not it's kinesthetic, how long you expect it to take, is there a cost associated with it, what group size is it appropriate for this activity, and then also if you're using a book, if you're basing it on maybe something you retrieve from another source, you want to provide a citation for that. We use APA, and of course we'll help curate this as well. And this is an example of an activity that is in the hub. Once it's curated, it will include its learning objectives if there's a download available to it, and any links that are maybe associated with this activity. This one is focusing on the notes, and this is where we might, if it's an activity we've used and we feel that there's some additional information that might be helpful, we might even say this worked really great with this particular group, and when I ran it this particular way, whether or not there's any materials needed, and also related tools. And related tools are there other tools that are like this, or are there tools that pair well with this? So that's what you'll find under related tools. We also really appreciate reviews. Again, so anyone who's done this activity before and they really liked it or they really hated it, go in and put a review, and then the theoretical frameworks. And of course, there's also tags up here. So you can also search for activities by specific tag words. And of course, here's our source information here. This one has also been revised to be a virtual activity. We actually have physical cards with pictures on it that we give out to students in class to do this activity. But I also have used Miraboard, and I think I've shown this to a couple times already in IPG, but this is a way you can have a virtual space with these cards that can be moved to different boxes to create groups and then carry through with the remaining steps of this activity. This is a tool that can be easily modified. This is an assessment, the communication flexibility scale. This is the scale right here. It's not very accessible right now, but if somebody wanted to turn this into a Qualtrics, for example, that could be very easily responded to by students, that's something that would lend itself to being revised. So there's even some simple things that would count as a revision from the original. There's also different spaces within the hub. So separate from completing that requirement for IPG of creating or revising an existing tool, we do want to encourage you all to engage with the hub as a resource. So there are collections where you can, if there's some activities you particularly like, you may want to take those URLs and put them in your own space. These are my favorite worldview frameworks activities from the digital toolbox. But it can also be a place to collect articles. It's just a space. And the nice thing about collections is they're shareable. So if you're collaborating with someone who's also in the hub, you can say, here's my collection on this particular topic. So that's also a great way to engage in the website. And this is kind of what collections look like. There'll be a link that you'll have these cards, and then you'll click on the link and go down into what's collected there. As I mentioned, tags, you can create your own tags when you're adding stuff in. And these are very useful for clustering activities or searching for activities. We have a IPG created tag. And so I do want to, if we have time, I want to share that. As
I have a quick question.
Yes, please.
So like in terms of revising one, so I really like the idea of the Amazing Race activity and using that to kind of help them to get the most out of their free time. If I would revise that to be something they would do in a day instead of a week, and with specific things I wanted them to visit in different cities, I mean, is that the type of, I mean, would that count as the revision assignment or? Absolutely. Any customization or revision that you do, I think is worthwhile because it gives your peers more resources, more things to use. So generally in that circumstance, I would recommend
draft out kind of a lesson plan of how you're specifically going to use this with your specific context. In fact, the more specifics, frankly, the better, because even if someone is teaching a different course, your specifics may give them ideas for how they can, make it their own. So that's my recommendation, kind of draft a lesson plan for that activity. And something specifically to that activity is that was originally designed for students who are on long-term study abroad. Address in yours the context for your students. You're saying you want them to do it in one day. Point that out. This is a short-term study abroad. We don't have large amounts of time to devote to this. So I want them to have a fairly short activity where they can still get the impact of doing these different things. So yeah, I think that's a great idea. We also have a research repository for publications. So if you have some intercultural, even if it's just like program evaluation, you've led a study abroad and you did some intercultural activities and you've maybe collected data on that in the past, and you're not quite at the level that you want to, try to publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, but you think you have some valuable information, this is a place that you can share that. And it's also a place that, again, you can find some publications that might be related to what you're doing as well. And there is a method for submitting your own publications, and members of the hub are always encouraged to do that. A white paper or just here's some data that I have that is pointing to a particular, interesting find. I think that's worth sharing in the community. These are some links. Again, this PowerPoint will be up in Brightspace, so you guys can access these links through this PowerPoint. So there's information about the hub there, as well as, this is the register on the URL. That's where you go to create your account. It's totally free. It only takes a few minutes to set up. And then also a how-to for creating a new tool is in there. And then finally, I did want to demonstrate very quickly the IPG. Let me get this stuff out of the way. Oh, Colleen asked earlier, and I apologize for not getting this, what would be an example of kinesthetic activity? One of the scavenger hunt types, absolutely, that's kinesthetic. Any activity that in order to accomplish the goal of the activity requires getting up and moving around. And that's not, you might have an activity where you say get into groups and they have to get up and go to get, but that's really not the point of the activity, right? That's preparing to do the activity. But if it's, you need to work within a group to build a tower, but don't talk while you're doing it, that's a kinesthetic activity. Or if you need to lift something or move something or walk across town doing a scavenger, that's definitely a kinesthetic activity. So thank you for asking about that. We try to include within the digital toolbox some kind of pop-up information about some of this stuff to explain. I'm not seeing the one for, maybe it's in the advanced search, but that's the general idea. We do have some of these pop-ups there that explain this, but I think kinesthetic is not as clear. We struggled with that when we were first creating this. I hope everyone is able to see the hub, and I'm not just randomly pointing at things. So I did want to go to tags and look at IPG created. And these are all tools that were created by your peers in previous IPG cohorts. These are either created by or revised tools. So if you want some ideas, you can search the IPG created one word tag and pull up any one of these to kind of get an idea of how you might revise a tool or create your own. There is a template for lesson plans. So we already have quite a few. I mean, this is just page one. There's 2 pages, I think. Nope, this is just 1 page. Sorry, I was thinking of something else. But we have quite a few already. I look forward to adding your alls into the list. And I think just going through that process of creating your own or revising one is very helpful, even if you only do it once.
Dan, so in my role here, I deal a lot with domestic bias, diversity, equity training. So it's usually looking at race and gender, so forth. So not as much intercultural or just different areas. So
Mhm.
would that be something that I would definitely include as
Absolutely.
well, or do I have to adapt it to put an intercultural spin on it?
So your focus can absolutely be diversity and inclusion or inclusion. And we have activities like that in the hub. In fact, that is one of the criteria that we try to curate based on whether or not this particular activity might be good for a diversity and inclusion focus. So those are certainly in there. There's also tags in there for diversity, equity, inclusion. We will try to align it with the AAC&U as best as we're able, because that's the primary searching source. But we'll work with you on that. And I'm guessing it would probably, most of the activities in diversity, equity, inclusion, I find fall into typically worldview frameworks or empathy or openness. But it could be any of them. But we'll definitely work with you on which one we think it aligns with best.
Yeah, because typically I don't use Hubble. I mean, I have an account and I've gone, there's only one activity I use, and that's a shipwrecked activity, because it does this deal with communication and conflict and so forth. But I never really added or looked, because it seemed like everything was focusing on an intercultural global, and I'm focusing more on a domestic. So that has always been a hiccup.
Yeah, and my take on that, and something I'd like you to consider is, we're actually, most of the time when we talk about culture, we start at that national level, right? Different cultures, international, or it's religion, and then we get into race, ethnicity. What we really want to do is start thinking about it in terms of not national difference, but actual cultural difference on the level of, it could be national, but it could also just be regional. It could just be Indiana culture. It could be, white culture, African-American culture. We can look at different identities and different intersectionality as the source for cultural difference. So that's something else to consider as well. But I would also encourage you to maybe use the tags and do some searches for diversity and inclusion, and see what else is in the toolbox as well that might be of interest to you.
Natasha, the intercultural people bingo really has nothing to do with other cultures. So that might be something you could adapt pretty easily too.
Okay, I'll definitely do that, because I do a lot of interactive games to try to show, how our own bias, stereotypes, whatever the case may be. And like one of the great games that I love to play is Dot. And that's where you put like a little sticky dot of different colors, but you either leave or you give two people two odd colors, and you tell them to group themselves. And then without any other instructions, they always group themselves to similar colors. And so you always start to debrief about, why did you do that? The only thing I said was group yourself. I didn't say do it by color or height or this. And so it goes into exclusion and how our bias of what we learn go into that. But that's always like, I'm looking at bias like on a domestic. So I was like, that would be a great thing, but of course you got to buy these sticky dots and make sure nobody has an oily forehead, because they fall off very quickly.
Yeah, I'm familiar with a similar activity in using playing cards, right? So you can have the royalty and hierarchy and numbers and stuff like that. There's also a really great activity I actually learned from Renee Thomas that's in the hub. It's How Easy is My Daily Life? And it's very similar to the privilege walk, without being so explicitly about privilege. It's more about just how the question, how easy is my daily life, based on, do I have to, how many times a day do I have to think about my religion? How many times a day do I have to think about how much access I have to healthcare? It has all these different questions, and we use Lego blocks, and you collect Legos each time the answer is yes. I think actually the question is more like, I have access to this, or I can do this, or, I collect, and then you go back and you talk about how many blocks do I have compared to everyone else in the room. And so there's a lot of different really great activities in there. I'm seeing we're past 2:30. I thank you all for giving up a little extra time here. One real quick thing I also want to kind of throw out there as we're thinking about revising, another kind of easy, low-hanging fruit, so to speak, for revision is that example of birds of a feather. It was an in-person activity that I turned into a virtual activity. If you want to do that approach, that's certainly an acceptable revision. Again, if you're creating something new that is not in the hub already, you can do that directly and just let me know, this is the tool I created. The title is usually enough for me to find it, and I can begin to help you curate it to get it finalized. But if you're revising, you'll need to draft your own kind of lesson plan for that. And then you and I can kind of collaborate on getting that, and I'll do the actual addition into the backside of the digital toolbox for that specific revision. So that's all I have today. Thank you all. I'll stick around for a little extra time if anybody has questions or wants to ask me about anything else having to do with IPG.
So
Thank you
Dan,
all.
just to clarify, the last one is next Thursday, is that correct? Number 10?
Yes, we're off Tuesday. It'll be the following Thursday. Yes. And I'm going to try to have module 10 up and live before the end of today.
And we all have to attend that one, correct?
Yeah, that one is required for everyone. But
So that one.
going in
reminds me-
if there's a conflict, of course, watching the video is also acceptable. We can
Oh,
just-
no, I have that. I just make sure those two plus 4 in between.
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.